Some days just pass by. But in tech, one single day can change absolutely everything. And for artificial intelligence, that day was October 7th, 2025. So let's jump in and unpack what happened, because this chain of events quietly, and I mean quietly, redefined our future.
So, what really happened that day? Was this the moment AI woke up? The singularity, the stuff of movies. Well, the answer, it's a lot less science fiction and way more about the real complex forces that are shaping our world right now.
Right, so it wasn't the singularity, that whole idea of AI growth just spiraling out of control. It was something else. It was an inflection point. It was the day that a few seemingly random, separate events all slammed together. And when the dust settled, they revealed 5 powerful forces, all converging at once, all shaping where we're headed. Let's break them down.
First up, building the factory. And before you think software, stop. We're talking about the actual physical foundation. I mean silicon, steel, and the massive, massive infrastructure that powers this whole revolution.
So on October 7th, we got a flurry of huge announcements that were basically building out the hardware stack for AI. Think of it like the picks and shovels for this new digital gold rush. We're talking about the super advanced tools needed to make the next Gen 2 nanometer chips. We're talking about specialized processors for everything from giant enterprise systems to the device in your pocket. And we're talking about billions with a B flowing into these enormous custom-built AI factory data centers, all wired together with ridiculously fast optical links. This wasn't just an upgrade. This was the full-on industrialization of AI, happening at a wild pace.
And this wasn't just some story for tech nerds either. This was big enough to start reshaping the entire global economy. I mean, just look at this. The World Trade Organization put out their forecast for 2025. And out of nowhere, they dramatically revised their prediction for global trade growth, cranking it up from less than 1% to almost 2.5%. So what on earth happened? Why the sudden good mood?
Well, this is why. 42%. That is a staggering number. The WTO basically said that almost half of all new global trade growth was coming directly from the exploding demand for AI hardware. Chips, servers, you name it. The takeaway here is massive. AI wasn't just a tech trend anymore. It was becoming one of the main engines of the entire global economy. Wow.
Okay, so the factory is getting built. Now what do you put on the assembly line? Well, the industry's focus was shifting to what it could produce, intelligent workers. We started hearing a lot about the AI agent. This isn't just an AI that answers a question. No, this is an autonomous system that can handle a whole complex job from start to finish. Think about processing an entire insurance claim, all the steps, without a human touching it.
And this is where you start to see the real strategic endgame. On October 7th, reports started leaking out about OpenAI's huge pivot. By getting major brands to launch apps inside ChatGPT and releasing a whole new developer toolkit, well, they weren't just selling a chatbot anymore. They were making a play to become the operating system for AI, the one central hub for everything. It's a classic move, straight from the same playbook Apple used to make the App Store the center of the mobile universe.
Of course, anytime you have this much power and this much money flying around, a battle for control is pretty much guaranteed. And it started playing out everywhere, from the halls of government to Wall Street.
Here in the US, a massive divide over how to handle all this just became undeniable. On one side, you had California. They basically stepped in to become the country's default AI regulator, pushing this really cautious approach focused on consumer rights and strict rules for developers. And on the other side, the White House, pushing its own plan that was all about pro-innovation, deregulation, and actively telling states like California, hey, back off, don't make your own rules.
And the conflict really boiled down to this. California was demanding things like risk assessments and total transparency. The White House, meanwhile, was demanding the removal of regulatory barriers. And to make it all even more chaotic, the U.S. federal government was in the middle of a shutdown. This created a total policy vacuum, leaving the entire industry stuck in this bizarre, fractured legal mess.
At the exact same time, the money was just flooding in. But not how you might think. A new report on Q3 funding showed that of all the venture capital in North America, a whopping 57% of it was going to AI companies, more than half of all VC money. And in hard numbers, that's $35.7 billion. Just let that sink in. In 3 months, that's nearly double the amount from the year before. But here's the catch. This fire hose of cash wasn't spreading out. It was all concentrating on just a handful of big, dominant, late-stage companies, creating this incredible gravitational pull.
And then there was this number. Reports started surfacing that OpenAI had committed over $1 trillion. $1 trillion. Just to lock down the computing power it figured it needed to win the AI race. This isn't just spending anymore. This was a strategic move to build an unbreachable wall around their business, a wall made of pure infrastructure. This is what kicked off what everyone started calling the compute bubble, this wild era where spending on computation just completely dwarfed any realistic way to make that money back.
So we've got the industrial might, we've got the financial firepower, but what was the science actually telling us about these powerful new tools? And this is where things get really interesting, because a kind of dual narrative started to emerge.
On the one hand, AI was proving to be this absolutely revolutionary tool for science. For instance, researchers at MIT used a generative AI to map out exactly how a new antibiotic works, how it kills bacteria. Now, this is a process that normally takes years of painstaking lab work. The AI nailed it in a matter of months. A huge win, right? This could speed up drug discovery like crazy.
But on that very same day, the scientific community dropped a major dose of reality. This quote is from a new research paper that found large language models are basically clueless about themselves. They consistently failed to recognize text they themselves had written. Their performance was no better than just guessing randomly. This really throws a wrench in the whole idea of AI self-awareness.
And other research just kept highlighting this fundamental brittleness. You had AI web agents that would completely fall apart if a website made one tiny code change. Researchers found new sneaky attacks that could secretly steer a model's decisions without anyone noticing. It all pointed to the same uncomfortable truth. While the commercial hype was screaming from the rooftops, the actual science was revealing a deep and, honestly, a worrying gap between that hype and the fragile reality of these systems.
So, what are we supposed to do with all this? When you put it all together, the events of October 7th, 2025 really force us to face 4 critical questions. And these are the questions that are going to define the future of this technology.
First, sustainability. Can the compute bubble actually survive? When you have companies making trillion-dollar spending commitments, but the revenue is just a tiny, tiny fraction of that, is that economic model even remotely sustainable? Or is the whole industry just racing towards a really painful crash if those killer apps don't show up to justify the insane cost?
Second, regulation. With California and the White House on a collision course, how is any company supposed to navigate that? Do you build your tech to meet the strictest possible rules? Or do you gamble on a federal policy that might come along later and penalize you for being too cautious? This level of uncertainty is just a massive roadblock to innovation. Third, what about competition? As all the capital, all the money, and all the computing power get concentrated into the hands of just a few super-rich companies, what happens to everybody else? Are we just destined for a future where a handful of platform giants control the entire AI ecosystem?
And that brings us to the final, and maybe the most important question of all: hype versus reality. How do we deal with this paradox? We know these tools can do amazing things, like accelerate scientific discovery, but we also know they are fundamentally brittle, they're insecure, and they have no real self-awareness. So how should we responsibly roll out these incredibly powerful but deeply flawed systems, especially in high-stakes situations? That is the central challenge that October 7th, 2025 brought into sharp focus. And it's a challenge we are all living with right now.